Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Today, we'll unpack the latest primary results with staff writer Doug Krenizl. And later in the show, we'll help you start preparing for the midterms with our tech director, Matt Latourelle, by previewing Ballotpedia's sample ballot tool. Doug, glad to have you back on the show.
Great to be here, Victoria.
Before we unpack this week's primary results, would you mind bringing listeners up to speed on the biggest headlines from the primaries that occurred on August 16th in Alaska and Wyoming, since we didn't touch on it in our last episode?
The biggest headline was out of Wyoming with the defeat of Republican U.S. Representative Liz Cheney, who lost to Harriet Hageman in her primary. Hageman is an attorney in the state and won by a pretty wide margin. Cheney received 29% of the vote to Hageman's 66%.
And obviously, Cheney, daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, has been an active member in the January 6th hearings that have been taking place over the summer.
Exactly. And that all played a big role in this race. Plus, this was the final primary this year featuring a Republican House member who voted to impeach Donald Trump in 2021 after the breach of the Capitol on January 6th. And Trump endorsed Hageman in this primary.
Interesting. So Cheney was one of the 10 Republicans who voted in favor of impeachment. Now that the dust has settled on those primaries, where do things stand?
Well, of those 10 incumbents, 4 didn't even seek re-election. Of the remaining 6, 4 lost to primary challengers, including Cheney, and then 2 representatives, Dan Newhouse in Washington and David Valadao in California, advanced to general elections. And now the 2 who advanced are both in states that use top 2 primaries, where every voter in the district participates rather than just voters of one party.
What about over in Alaska? This was the first widespread usage of their new top 4 primary system since voters approved it in 2020, which means that the top 4 vote getters advanced to the general election.
That's right. And in Alaska, we had our eyes on 2 key races, one of which was Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski's re-election bid. She advanced and also received the most votes in the race for her seat, with nearly 44% of the vote. Kelly Tshibaka, who Donald Trump endorsed, finished second with about 40% of the vote. And they'll most likely be joined by another Republican, Buzz Kelly, and Democrat Patricia Chesbrough, though we haven't called that race quite yet.
Got it. And what about the state's lone U.S. House district? Former Republican Governor Sarah Palin is waging a political comeback there. How's that going?
Well, the comeback lives to see another day. Voters are actually deciding 2 races on the 16th. The first was a special general election to fill the vacant House seat caused by the death of U.S. Representative Don Young earlier this year. The primary for that special election happened last June, and Palin, along with another Republican, Nick Begich, and Democrat Mary Peltola, advanced to the special general election that was being decided a few weeks ago. A 4th candidate also advanced, but dropped out after the primary. And right now, Peltola has the most votes, followed by Palin and then Begich. But this election is using ranked choice voting, which means that once we have the first round of votes tabulated, the candidate with the lowest number of votes will get dropped out, and then whoever voted for that candidate, their second choice votes will be distributed among the remaining candidates. So with Begich in third right now, if that holds, then once that first round is all done, he'll be out of the race, and then they'll take everyone who voted for Begich and distribute those votes to either Palin or Peltola, depending on who their second choice was, until one candidate gets over 50%. And we're not going to know the results for this race until the end of the month.
Sure. And then we also had a primary for the same office. That's kind of confusing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely glad I didn't have to deal with that ballot because, it does seem like it would be a little confusing. Well, especially because like the general election was ranked choice, but the primaries are not ranked choice. The primaries are just pick 4 and the top 4 go to the general. So I'd like to see a picture of that ballot. But the winner of the special election will serve until January. And then there was a regularly scheduled primary to set things up for the November election. And then the winner of that election will serve a full 2-year term. And Peltola, Palin, and Begich are all running in that race too, and are currently the top 3. And then whoever finishes 4th will advance to the November ballot as well.
Well, thanks for bringing us up to speed on those races, Doug. Now let's turn our attention to the primaries that happened on August 23rd. We had some interesting races in New York and Oklahoma, but let's start in the battleground state of Florida. Talk to me about Florida's U.S. Senate primary.
The Senate race in Florida is for Republican Marco Rubio's seat, which he's held for 11 years and is running for re-election.
Who did the Democrats nominate to challenge Rubio then?
Democrats have nominated Val Demings, who currently represents Florida's 10th congressional district. She pretty much cleaned house, received 85% of the vote or so. During her time in Congress, she's served on the Committee of Homeland Security, the Committee of Oversight and Government Reform. And then in 2020, Demings was actually one of the 7 impeachment managers in the U.S. Senate trial against President Trump. And that was the first impeachment proceedings. Before entering the House, Demings worked in law enforcement for about 3 decades. From 2007 to 2012, she was Orlando's first female chief of police. And then looking at the general election in this race, most early polling favors Rubio, but we'll have to keep our eyes on this one as it will certainly be one of the more high-profile Senate challenges this November.
Democrats also nominated a gubernatorial challenger to incumbent Ron DeSantis. He's considered by many to be a top contender for the party's presidential nomination in 2024. Who will DeSantis be facing?
Yeah, this was primarily a battle between Nikki Fried, who is currently the lone statewide elected Democrat in Florida. She's the Commissioner of Agriculture. And then U.S. Representative Charlie Crist. Worth noting, Crist is actually also a former Republican governor of Florida. He held the office from 2007 to 2011 before switching parties. And Crist won that primary nomination. So he'll be going up against DeSantis in November.
I'm pretty sure no politician has ever been governor twice under the banner of different parties, excluding governors who change party affiliation while in office. So that would definitely be an interesting outcome for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, Crist will have a chance to make that happen. After a convincing win in the primary, he got about 60% of the vote. And like you said, he's probably got his work cut out for him. In addition to DeSantis's popularity in the state and amongst Republicans nationally, he's also got a pretty large war chest, having raised over $100 million for his reelection bid so far. And then outside of those headlines in Florida, another interesting story was the primary victory of Maxwell Frost.
Oh, right. He's the 25-year-old that was endorsed by Bernie Sanders, wasn't he?
That's right. In a crowded Democratic primary for Florida's 10th district, Frost emerged victorious with 34% of the vote. Since this district leans heavily Democratic, it's pretty likely Frost will be the youngest member of the House when things kick off next year.
And the first congressional representative from Gen Z. Turning our attention to New York, there were a bunch of interesting House races we've been following. Can we touch on a few of them? Let's start with a Democratic primary for the 12th congressional district. It was one of the most high-profile incumbent versus incumbent races we've seen.
That's right. And if I were still living in my old apartment in New York, that would have been my congressional district. It was actually the last incumbent versus incumbent primary of the cycle. After redistricting, longtime Democratic representatives Carolyn Maloney and Jerry Nadler, who were both first elected to Congress 29 years ago in 1992, went toe-to-toe. In this contest, Nadler more than doubled Maloney's vote total. Former Obama staffer Suraj Patel, who challenged Maloney unsuccessfully for her seat in 2018 and 2020, placed third. And leading into this primary, U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer from New York, Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts, and the New York Times editorial board all endorsed Nadler. So, it doesn't come as too big of a surprise, but still, it brings Maloney's long political career to a seeming end. But, you never know.
A long career for sure. And it looks like Maloney isn't the only House incumbent who lost in New York. What can you tell us about the Democratic primary in the state's 10th district?
Yeah, it looks like first-term Representative Mondaire Jones might not be returning to Congress next year. He's currently in third place in that primary behind Daniel Goldman, an attorney who led the first impeachment against Donald Trump and heir to the Levi Strauss fortune, blue jeans and whatnot, and Yulan Ye, a state senator. So Jones actually represents the 17th district right now, which covers areas north of Manhattan. The 10th district here covers southern Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn. So a pretty different layout than his current district. We haven't called the race yet, but if things stay as they are, Goldman will win the Democratic nod. Actually won the Working Families Party endorsement already, meaning she could still run in the general election on that party's line if she wants to.
That's interesting. Another interesting race we were watching was not a primary, but a special election in New York's 19th congressional district, which became open after Democratic Representative Antonio Delgado was tapped to be lieutenant governor of New York. The 19th district is considered a swing district that Biden carried with less than 2 percentage points in 2020, and Trump actually won by 7 points in 2016. The race was between Democrat Pat Ryan and Republican Mark Molinaro. How did that race turn out?
Ryan defeated Molinaro with 51% of the vote to Molinaro's 49%. So he will be heading to Congress until January. Another one of those special election situations where filling a vacancy goes until January. But keep in mind, this election took place under the 19th district's old lines, not the new ones created during the last redistricting cycle. So Ryan, who will now become a member of Congress, is going to be running for re-election for a full term, but in the 18th district, which is also competitive, but leans more Democratic. Meanwhile, Molinaro will be back on the ballot again in the 19th district under the new lines in November. Again, still a competitive district, but with more of a Republican lean that you were talking about.
And before I let you go, Doug, voters in Oklahoma also had some runoffs to decide in the U.S. Senate races. And as a recap for our listeners, Oklahoma is actually holding elections for both of its U.S. Senate seats this year. One is up for a regular election, and the other is to fill out the remaining 4 years of retiring Senator Jim Inhofe's term. How did these runoffs plan out?
Yeah, both Democrats and Republicans had runoffs in these races, none of which were that close. In the regularly scheduled race, Madison Horn won the Democratic runoff with about 64% of the vote. She's going to be running against incumbent U.S. Senator James Lankford in November. And then in the special election, the Republicans had a runoff, which U.S. Representative Markwayne Mullin won. And he's going to be facing former Democratic U.S. Representative Kendra Horn, no relation to Madison Horn, in that general election.
Got it. Well, thanks for coming on and breaking down all of these election results. We look forward to having you back soon.
Most definitely. Thanks for having me.
Moving on, it might seem like primary season, and summer for that matter, has been stretching on forever. But believe it or not, only 4 states are left to go before November. Before we know it, sweater weather will be upon us. Midterm elections are less than 80 days away. Everything we do here at Ballotpedia is to help inform voters. And heading into the general election, one of the best ways you can prepare is by reviewing your ballot before heading off to the polls. We've tried to make that as simple as possible with our sample ballot tool. Here to help us out with a little tutorial is our tech whiz, Matt Latourelle. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Victoria. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. As everyone may or may not know, Ballotpedia is a completely remote workplace outside of a few meetups throughout the year. I actually had the pleasure a few weeks back of meeting Matt in person for the first time here in Dallas. Matt, you're one of the longest tenured staffers here at Ballotpedia. Would you mind telling us about your history?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of stumbled into Ballotpedia. It was a happy circumstance starting to do data entry way back in 2008 when the company was just starting. There was a gap in specifically ballot measure and state legislative coverage online that we were trying to fill. And obviously we're still filling that gap, but expanding into a lot more. So it's been a really exciting journey. I've kind of developed into more of like a technical role as we've developed more efficiencies and more automations and more software to power what we're trying to do for voters here. So that's been really fun.
Yeah, it's probably been amazing to see the transformation from manually doing everything on site to having the database and being able to generate a lot of the things that appear on site.
Yeah, definitely.
So one of the projects you've worked on is the sample ballot tool. Can you give us a bit about the backstory of the sample ballot tool? What was the inspiration and why we thought it would be worth creating for voters?
Sure. So we developed a sample ballot tool to sort of put together in a more customized way the voter information and the election information we were compiling, because the sample ballot tool allows you to input your address and see what elections that Ballotpedia is covering are going to appear on your ballot. And so it surfaces a lot of our data in a very customized way. And in some localities, this type of app is available from the state or other government website. And in some cases, it isn't. In some places, it's really hard to even find out the names of the candidates who will appear on your ballot, much less anything about them to help inform your vote. And so we thought if we had a standardized tool that no matter where you are in the country, you can use this to look up your elections in a similar way, that could help fill in those gaps. And we've just been building that out and kind of using that as a link to additional information about these candidates on other pages on Ballotpedia, such as when they answer our candidate survey, tell us a little bit about themselves for the benefit of the voters, or any type of additional data or analysis that we have about those races and elections.
Yeah, I think what is cool is it is so standardized. So, like, if you're moving across the country and you're trying to find that information out, you just can come to Ballotpedia, type in your new address, and it's going to be just the way it was the last time you used our sample ballot tool. When someone types in their address, what will appear?
When you type in your address, you'll first get a list of the upcoming elections that will be on your ballot. So that will be, if there's a primary coming up, you'll see that date. You might see the general election date, depending on what's happening in your area. And you get to select from there which one you want to look at which point you'll see the candidates. And so we display candidates and which offices they're running for, as well as their party affiliation. And that allows you then to link off from there and learn more about each one.
It also displays like yes, no boxes for any ballot measures that may be in your jurisdiction.
Yeah, and those are really helpful because I think, your team, I guess, customizes those, right? So the ballot measures are distilled down into more human readable
Simplified
yes and no.
terms.
What
yes.
does this do?
Yeah, good point. I think you've answered all of my questions. We'll have a link to the sample ballot tool in our show notes. Do you have anything else to add?
The other thing I'd add is I think a side purpose of the sample ballot lookup that we've seen with redistricting being really useful is because this is customized to your address and we have all of the latest data on the new maps that are going to apply to these people being elected this year when they take office in January. It's a good way to kind of see what elections will apply to you, even considering redistricting, which is sometimes hard to tell for your particular area.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially with how many lines were changed by courts and stuff. Some people may feel like they're in limbo. Thanks, Matt, for coming on and breaking this down for us.
Thanks for having me.
Hey listeners, this is Jeff Paulet, Ballotpedia's editor-in-chief, back with you. Here at Ballotpedia, our mission is to ensure that every citizen has access to information to make informed decisions about their vote in every election. If this is a dream you share, well, you're in luck. Ballotpedia is hiring and looking to add to our team of fast learners and creative problem solvers who are eager to work hard to make the world a better place. To learn more about our current openings, you can find them at ballotpedia.org/jobs or via the link in our show notes. Thanks, and hope to see you here at Ballotpedia.
Woo, it's been hot out these past couple months. You know what else is hot? These footnote facts, especially hot because my AC broke over the weekend in Florida. Cool. And speaking of Florida, since Victoria brought it up with Doug, no, there has not yet been a governor in Florida who won elections under two-party banners. So we'll see if Charlie Crist becomes the 1st of November. Anyway, this episode's topic is voter turnout. You know, that thing a lot of us do in this country, very pertinent right now. And leading things off is our trivia question of the week. What is the most common way for people to register to vote? Think about it, and I'll tell you very soon. So, voting. Obviously, it's a hallmark of our political system, but compared to other democratized countries, the U.S. is actually towards the low end of the spectrum of voter turnout. The mid and late 1800s in the U.S. were where we see the heights of voter turnout. But how do we exactly calculate it? Well, that depends on who you ask and what their goal is. Typically, it's the number of voters casting a ballot divided by the total number of registered voters. But turnout can sometimes be seen as the number of participating voters in an election divided by the total voting eligible population or the total voting age population. Not everybody above the minimum voting age of 18 is eligible to vote and cast a ballot, and this is the most visible in the case of people with felony convictions. As of August 2022, Maine and Vermont are the only states that allow felons to vote while incarcerated, and there are varying rules around the country as to if and when felons can regain suffrage after they serve their sentence. Then some people are eligible to register, but they just don't do so. So in terms of when elections are held, in general, presidential elections see the highest rates of turnout, followed by midterm elections, then November elections, and odd-numbered years. And special elections are a bit erratic because of the fact that they can happen at many points in the calendar, and every state has their own rules for that. But oftentimes they are even lower rates of turnout just because of how all over the place they can be. And then some offices, particularly local offices, even have their general elections in a month other than November, like May or June, and thus usually see extremely low turnout. And speaking of local races, a quick look at the level of government shows that federal races, like Congress, have the highest rates of turnout, followed by state, like state house, then local races. But voter turnout for lower levels of government tends to increase when those elections are concurrent with elections for higher levels of government. So something like mayoral races will see more turnout when there's also the U.S. Senate on the ballot. Lastly, some factors that correlate with higher turnout rates. Higher income and educational attainment are a couple examples. Older voters also vote more than younger voters. And usually white voters turn out at higher rates than non-white voters, though the total share of non-white voters has seen an upward trend, especially amongst groups like Asian Americans. And women have also voted at higher rates than men in recent elections. Now, back to our trivia question, which was, what is the most common way for people to register to vote? And if you answered through a Department of Motor Vehicles, you done did it. You win. Doesn't everyone love the DMV? Well, except for everyone. That's the end of today's Footnote Facts. Paulie Politics is signing off and handing the mic back off to Victoria.
Thanks, Paul. Before we end the show today, I wanted to make a quick plug for one of Ballotpedia's newsletters, Robe and Gavel. It'll help you keep up with the Supreme Court's moves and all other judicial happenings around the U.S. Here's a glimpse at this month's edition, released on August 8th. Since July, SCOTUS has accepted one new case to be argued on the merits. United States versus Texas questions whether the U.S. Department of Homeland Security violated U.S. immigration law and the Administrative Procedures Act. In September 2021, DHS stated it would, quote, prioritize for apprehension and removal non-citizens who are a threat to our national security, public safety, and border security, end quote. To date, the court has agreed to hear 27 cases during its 2022-2023 term. To read more about SCOTUS and America's courts, go to ballotpedia.org and find the email updates tab, or use the link in our show notes to sign up for the Robe and Gavel newsletter, or check out our other newsletters. That's all I have for you for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Doug, Matt, and Paul for coming on the show. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be back next week for an update on school board elections. If you have any questions, comments, or just love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.